Quick review. Capital versus lowercase. What's the difference?
One has multiple.
One, there's only one for the
Either one solution or all solutions. Which one's which? Capital. So I'm looking for the one and only principal value here. Principal value inverse sine. What's my reference angle? When does sine equal square root of 3 over 2? 60. What is the one quadrant we would want to be in for principal value sine negative? Fourth quadrant, right? Sine's positive first, negative in the fourth. So remember, you're not allowed to pass through the quadrants we restrict. So second, third quadrant are off the limits. So how do we get a 60 in the fourth? The answer is negative 60 degrees. Good so far? If it was lowercase, what would you do if it was lowercase? Come on, follow me. Now you have to list what? All answers. So my reference angle here would still be 60. But now I want all of them, so I need all the quadrants where sine is negative, which is third and fourth. What's a 60 in the third? 240. What is a 60 in the fourth? 300. And then you put the plus 360 ends. Because the end tells you, like, I can go once around, twice around, 3 times around. If I keep adding 360, I'm going to find another answer, and another answer, and another answer. Okay? Number of times around the circle. Could be. Is this answer, is this negative 60 in that set as well? Is that somewhere in there? Yeah, absolutely it is. If you take 360, or if you take this 300 and minus a 360, aren't you going to have negative 60? So yeah, that answer is somewhere in here. Remember, whenever you do these, there's infinite number of answers. When we do principal value, we're just looking for that one important answer. Now, I want to talk about these types of questions. What do you think should happen when you take the cosine of an inverse cosine kind of thing? They should. They should. I mean, if you think about it, like the toaster and the inverse toaster discussion, if you have a toaster, you put bread in, it does something magical to it, right? You have an end result. You have that nice, warm, hot toast. The inverse toaster, you'd put that output in, and what would you get out? Where you started. So basically the two machines cancel each other out, and whatever your input is also your output. So what do you think the answer to this should be? It should be negative 1/2. We all agree? Well, we can solve it. To solve these, you go inside out. So inverse cosine of a half. When does cosine equal a half? Well, that's 60. For cosine principal value, what's the quadrant we want for negative? Second quadrant. What's a 60 in the second? 120. So the answer to this is 120. Then we got to take the cosine of 120. Well, again, it's a 60-degree angle in the second quadrant. Cosine of 60 is a half. Second quadrant, you're negative. So yeah, it works. It works most of the time. The answer is, when you have something like these, or you have something like this, where you have the inverse cosine of the cosine, most of the time, your answer is the input. But it doesn't always work. I can guarantee you the answer to this question right here is not 210. Just by looking at it. Because yesterday I told you in your notes, remember when you have sine, inverse sine principal value, and we said, you know, sine's positive in the top two, but for principal value we only care about these two answers, right? That means your answer has to be somewhere between negative 90 and 90, right? And then for cosine, we said cosine's positive in the right two, and for principal value, we only use the top two quadrants, which means what is the range of numbers your answer has to be between? 0 to 180, right? Your final answer after you take an inverse cosine has to be somewhere between 0 and 180, right? Then it's mathematically impossible for this answer to be 210 degrees. It can't be. So sometimes what ends up happening is you jump quadrants. The reference angle should stay the same, but we're going to end up jumping quadrants. So for these, I would say just solve them from the inside out. What is the cosine of 210? What's my reference angle? 30. So that's a 30-degree angle in the third quadrant, right? What's cosine of 30? Square root of 3 over 2. Third quadrant cosine is negative. So the answer to this, cosine of 210, is negative square root of 3 over 2. Now, we got to do the principal value inverse cosine of that. Well, when is cosine square root of 3 over 2? Well, that's still 30, right? But what is the one quadrant that we would want to use where cosine is negative for principal value? That's the second quadrant. So what is a 30-degree angle in the second quadrant? 150. The final answer here is 150. What does 210 and 150 have in common? They both have the same reference angle. So the reference angle doesn't change. What changes is you might jump from a negative to a positive. You might jump quadrants kind of thing. But that's what's going to end up happening. So, you know, the way I like to think of it as the inverse machine, that's the weird machine, right? Like think the toaster. The toaster is the normal one. The inverse is the weird one. If you toast it first and then inverse toast it, it works. You get right back to where you started. But if you put it in backwards, you take a piece of bread and you put it in the inverse toaster first, I don't even know what the output would be. Like dough. And then you toast it and you'd think might get back to bread, but it might cook it and all of a sudden instead of wheat bread, you have white bread or something. So you have a different type of bread. You're still going to have bread. It might just be a different type of bread. So if you have the inverse on the outside, weird things can happen sometimes. But if it's, the toaster's on the outside, that's how I like to think of these things. So, because inverse toasters are just weird. Just know that this kind of thing sometimes can cause you to jump quadrants. A question that is absolutely fair game for a non-calculator part of a quiz on this Friday would be something like this. Absolutely fair game for a non-calculator quiz. Man, does that look like an ugly problem, doesn't it? Work it from the inside out. Ignore the sign for a second. Just solve that. When is sine a half? 30. It's negative, so what's the quadrant you want for sine? Fourth. So what's the 30 in the fourth? Negative 30 degrees. Plus, what about cosine half? When does cosine equal a half? 60. What quadrant do I want? What's a 60 in the second? 120. So far, I'm up to 150. Minus, what's sine of 1? When is sine 1? It's 90. What's negative 30? Sorry, that was negative 30. What's negative 30 plus 20? What's 90 minus 90? What is the sine of a 0-degree angle? 0. Was that really a difficult question? No. That is probably a 3 on the difficulty scale. If you know your table and you know your quadrants, this is not a difficult question. So, everybody take out your homework. Page 257, 258. How far did we get yesterday with you guys? Did we do 18?
No, we got to like
You got to 16?
12 or something.
Well, you guys should be able to do 10 through 16, yes? Because what's the only thing you got to do with 10 through 16? Type in a calculator. How are you going to get your calculator to do principal value? It's the only thing it can do. So, yeah. Now, looking at number 18. What should happen with that cosine and the inverse cosine? They should cancel. What do you think the answer is? It's 0.8667. Yeah, absolutely. Now, number 20. Those aren't going to cancel because, number 1, they're not the same trig function. So you got sine of the inverse cosine of negative a half. When you do these, inside out, when is cosine a half? 60. What is the one quadrant you want to be in where cosine's negative for principal value? Second. What's a 60 in the second? 120. And now you got to take the sine of 120. Well, my reference angle is 60. What's sine of 60? Square root of 3 over 2. Second quadrant, sine is positive or negative? Positive. So, there you go. When you get to questions like 24, 26, 28, just convert them to degrees. Don't write negative 4 pi over 3. When you do 24, just write the inverse cosine, so arc cosine of cosine of, but I wouldn't write negative 4 pi over 3. What's 180 divided by 3? 60? 60 times 4 would be 240. So I would solve that problem. Do the inverse cosine of the cosine of a negative 240 degrees. Keeping in mind, where is a negative 240 degree angle? Well, that'd be negative 180. So it looks like you're up here in the second quadrant. That's nothing more than a 60 in the second quadrant. Make sense? When you get to 30, what's the only thing you got to do with those? Just type them in. Those are just calculator questions. When you get to 42, you see where it says pi down there? Don't write pi. Convert it to degrees. What's pi in degrees? 180. Just write a 180 there. Number 44, instead of pi over 2, put a 90 there. For 38 and 40, all you're doing with those is, remember we said yesterday that the graph of the inverse sine, the principal value, all that was this. That one little curve, right? So what's going to happen when you put that minus 1 attached to it? What's it going to do to that original curve? Move it down a little bit. That's all. Yeah. Thanks. When you times it by 3, what's number 40? When you times it by 3, what's it do to any graph? Makes it a little steeper. That's all. Makes it go a little higher. That's all. I'm not too worried about those. All right? Yes.